Just conscious in terms of war memorials that in St Malachy's Roman Catholic Church in Belfast, which was famously refurbished in the last 2 or 3 years, the war memorial from the Great War has actually been reinstated in the church. And it's most peculiar because it covers the years 1914 to 1917 and was the gift of an English woman, Mrs. Blakiston Houston, whose husband was a major in the First World War. And you'll see it in St Malachy's refurbished church in Alfred Street. Have we a first question, please? Yes, Mark, down here, 4 rows from the back.
Yeah, I just would like the panel to comment on sort of what was going on within nationalism from 1914, because it seems to be somewhat complex, where we went from a situation in 14 where there was probably overwhelming support for the approach of John Redmond and to support the British in the war effort, till a situation in 1918 or 1919 where I think Irish men coming back from the front almost came back in disgrace and or were treated that way. And like that seems incredible, because even in countries where maybe the population disagrees with the war, they still support the troops. And I was wondering, like, do the recruitment figures, and it was illustrated that, you know, even in 1918 there was sizable numbers of people joining up. Do the recruitment figures give any indication that Catholic recruitment maybe fall off? But like when the people, you know, did come back, there was obviously other things going on. There was the Anglo-Irish War and the Civil War, and did any of those troops then get involved in those conflicts? And if you just finally, if you fast forward till the Second World War, you had a situation whereby Irish men, Irish soldiers of the Irish Army were defecting and joining the British Army, and there was Irish citizens were joining the British Army as well. So does that illustrate there was all sorts of complex undercurrents going on within nationalism over a period of about 30 years?
Keith, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's very difficult to make any sort of pat and easy assumptions about what's actually going on. I mean, what's interesting, I mean, Jim mentioned the 1918 general election, which is this kind of sort of seismic moment where Sinn Féin sweep across, you know, have this staggering election victory. But when you unpick it a bit, many of those MPs returned there are returned unopposed. And what you've got in 1918 is as much, I mean, there's certainly a Sinn Féin victory, there's no question about that. But there's also an Irish party loss. I mean, the Irish party is completely demoralised by the events of the war. I mean, that political misjudgment, as it turns out, by the end of the war, knocks the stuffing out of them. Redmond's died. No one takes up the baton, as it were. And they're just, you know, they're so sort of dispirited. And there's a kind of sense of the soldiers coming back, not so much they're treated as sort of traitors, but it's kind of what, you know, the classic whatever you say nothing. You just keep your head down and you just wait things out. And in that sense, there's a collusion in not, you know, not dwelling on the past in that way, and these huge events sweep over you, and you begin to see the nationalism, Irish nationalism, coming out again. In a way, the Cork War Memorial is very interesting, because these are it's the revenge, if you like, of the Constitutional Nationalist Party. It's Fianna Cumann Gael rather than Fianna Fáil. It's the you know, there are elements in these parties of the more conservative, you know, the less militant exercise. And the Second World War is precisely another occasion where you get old family traditions of people joining up, coming through. There's quite a very interesting debate going on at the moment about the Irishmen who desert from the Irish Army and join the British Army, and they ought to be retrospectively, you know, commended for what they did. Now, in fact, they didn't necessarily join up solely to be on the right side, you know, to fight for freedom against fascism. It suits people now to think that that's the way. But there are people, they will, you know, there'll be these multi-layered reasons for joining up at the time. And a lot of them are about getting away from home, a lot of them are about a better job, a lot of them are about dull old Ireland, you know, an adventure, and you know, a bit more dough. And it's nothing to do with nationalism, I think, in a way. And we tend to sort of reflect back on these and say, these are clearly political statements, you know, the British shilling, the King's shilling, but in the last 30 years in Northern Ireland, we're wearing, actually, a British Army uniform. Crown forces meant something very, very specifically kind of political and engaged. And I don't think you can back project that into the First World War, the Second World War.
Jim?
Yes. Recently I read a book, was it A Hero If I Fall, a Card If I Return, or vice versa. Anyway, it's about the nature of the very, very diverse nature, it's Paddy McGill quote. A hero if I fall, a card if I return, that's what it is. It's a very, very diverse responses of Irish nationalists to the Great War, and it's geographically different as well. There are a couple of very important things to be taken into account. I think that when the Irish Civil War was fought from 1922 to 1923, Cumann Gael came into power with a specific task of state formation. And it was because of the nature of the Irish Civil War, fought over the treaty. They felt it incumbent upon them to emphasise the sort of the virility of their Irishness. And to harken back to service in the Great War would have been an embarrassment to them. So I think Keith's right, it was sidelined a lot. And that was in the South. There was documented cases of people coming back. Their older brother had married somebody who was very pro-Sinn Féin, medals thrown in the bin and all, but other people would have come back and joined the Republican movement, fought in the War of Independence and so on. There's no uniform response of Irish soldiers to this. There's a uniform coyness, I suppose, about service in the Great War, no matter what they did. And that was because of outcomes which they couldn't have foreseen when they joined. As for recruitment, it did tend to tail off, yes, it did. And everywhere by 1918, 1917. It's true in England as well. Like the conscription crisis, oddly enough, from which Sinn Féin benefited so much, the new Sinn Féin reorganised in late 1917. It was really a ploy, to a large extent. It's agreed now by the Minister of Munitions, Prime Minister Lloyd George, to try to persuade people. He didn't think conscription would ever be a goer in Ireland, but he needed to try and persuade munition workers and strikes and so on in England to follow the Westminster line. But this is probably the fulcrum that people turned against the war itself. And they turned against the war rather than Irish soldiers, but Irish soldiers did feel at a loss very often, to explain what happened.
Do you want to add anything to that, Philip?
What I just want to say is that, I mean, the volatility of most countries socially and economically during this war across Europe has to be taken into account. You know, in Germany, for example, you know, there's virtually a socialist communist revolution taking place in certain parts of the country. In Russia, we know what happened there by way of a revolution. And, you know, we shouldn't be surprised that in a time of huge flux and change, all kinds of attitudes are flipped on their heads, you know, and that all people are all subject to all kinds of political and allegiance changes. What I do want to say is interesting, just a wee anecdote. Rose Perry, who's a friend of mine, is the sister of the late Paddy Devlin, and she tells interesting stories about her father coming back from the war, and at a later stage, then he joins the IRA, and at a later stage, he has the possibility of 2 pensions, one for the British Army and one for the Irish Republican Army, and he has to decide between them. And he decides for the British Army pension because he's a family to feed, and it's larger. So there are all kinds of little interesting anecdotes that come out of it, and humorous things, if you like, as well as the tragedies of people who are sort of caught inside the new, regime change, if you like.
And of course, Kevin O'Higgins, one of the founding fathers of the Free State, as Keith has pointed out in his book, said famously around 1922-23 that to remember the men who died, the Irish men who died in the Great War, who included one of his own brothers, would be to give a wrong twist to the origins of the independent Irish state. So that's a problem also in the 1920s in independent Ireland.